So where we were last week is Pip is in London, becoming a man, becoming a fine gentleman, should I say. And he's kind of kicked out Joe because Joe's from his past life. And he's like, whatever, old boy, get out of here. He kind of felt bad about that. But, well, there it is. He still did it. He's kind of over Estella. Not really over her, but, she's not really in the front of his mind anymore. Until, when he was 20 years old, living in London, he received good news from his past, and he learned through Mr. Jaggers that Estella had just returned from France. She was coming to live in London, where she invited him to call upon her. I was so happy that I was to see Estella that my high spirits overflowed. I sang and I laughed, and I was pleased with everything in life. I realized that Herbert Pockets is Pip's roommate. He's a gentleman also, but he's kind of poor. But Pip supports him, and in return, Herbert Pocket kind of helps guide Pip through being a gentleman. I realized that Herbert might find my continual cheerfulness rather tiresome. I apologized to him, and I shyly confessed that I was in love with Estella. Instead of being amazed, Herbert replied matter-of-factly, "Yes, I know." "What? How do you know?" I stammered. "Oh, boy, it's been written all over you since you first told me about your boyhood visits to Miss Havisham's house," replied Herbert. Well, it was a relief to pour out my admiration of Estella's beauty, my own unworthiness of her love, and my deep, heartfelt hope to marry her. I confided that Miss Havisham undoubtedly intended that I should have married Estella, or why else would she be making me a gentleman and settle a fortune on me? Herbert agreed that, like all Miss Havisham's relatives, he assumed that this must be the case. But then a rather somber expression came over Herbert's face. "Now, Pip, old boy, I'm going to tell you something disagreeable, perhaps. First, I want you to know that I, too, am in love. Her name is Clara Barley. I want you two to meet. But, Pip, I mention her now so you will not think that I had any hopes of marrying Estella. I am deeply in love with Claire." Well, no such thought had ever crossed my mind, but I let Herbert continue. "You see, Pip, when Mr. Jaggers laid down the conditions of your great expectations, he did not mention that you were required to marry Estella as one of them, did he?" I shook my head to let Herbert know that there had been no such conditions. "Then, Pip, you are not bound to her, and I urge you most strongly to detach yourself from her." "What? Why, Herbert?" "Oh, Pip. Think of Estella's upbringing, and how Miss Havisham has manipulated her thoughts and feelings. Think how proud and cold Estella is, and how much like Miss Havisham she behaves." I turned away. "I can never detach myself from Estella. I adore her completely." Now, his concern for my welfare touched me deeply, though his opinion of Estella's character upset me and stayed with me for a long while. It was about this time that I turned 21, and Mr. Jaggers gave the handling of my money into my own hands finally. He had allowed me to go into debt to a certain extent, and now I resolved to live on my splendid income of £500 a year. I also received a birthday gift of £500 from my benefactor. Cheese, chocolate, red wine, and bacon. Speaking of £500 a year, yes. Secretly, with Mr. Wemmick's help, I used that sum that I was given for my birthday to buy a position for Herbert in the newly established shipping business. An honest and clever young man named Cleriker owned the firm, and he needed the funds and intelligent help. I contracted to make more payments in time, so that Herbert would one day become a full partner. When Herbert told me of a chance meeting with Cleriker and the offer of a position, his ecstatic face was reward enough for me. Herbert need never know the identity of his benefactor, me. Day by day, he grew happier in his new career. Meanwhile, Estella had become an instant success in London, and she was enjoying every minute of it. Miss Havisham had arranged for Estella to live with a widow who had a daughter about Estella's age. This family was well bred and had many connections with high society, of course. Estella began to call on me to escort her to balls and parties and shopping expeditions. Now, you would think, and I guess I should, have been very happy, but I wasn't. Estella treated me like a half-brother or like her secretary. Even though her many admirers were jealous of my position at her side, Estella showed me no favors. Instead, she said to me one evening, "Pip, oh, Pip, will you never listen to any warnings about me?" "Do you mean warnings against being attracted to you, Estella?" I asked her. "If you don't know what I mean, you are blind." No, I would have said that love is blind, but I always hesitated to press my love on her since I knew she would obey Miss Havisham. Estella ordered me to escort her to see Miss Havisham, who wanted her to visit, but disliked her traveling alone. As we sat by the fire after dinner, Miss Havisham could not take her eyes off Estella. She was eager to hear about Estella's conquest from her own lips, for Estella wrote her regularly, and Miss Havisham already knew the names of all of Estella's discarded suitors. When I saw Miss Havisham's eyes glitter with wicked delight, I realized that this was her revenge on the man who had left her on their wedding day. To get even, Miss Havisham would hurt every man she could through Estella. Miss Havisham grasped Estella's hand, but when Estella pulled her hand away, the old lady had a taste of her own medicine. Terribly hurt, she cried out, "Estella, you are tired of me." With a composed face and calm tone, Estella answered, "I am only tired of myself." "You stone! You cold heart!" screamed Miss Havisham, waving her stick about. "You have trained me to be that way," Estella stated flatly. "But not to me! You cold heart, you!" "You are my mother by adoption. I owe everything to you. I will do anything you ask, but I cannot do the impossible. You taught me to be cold and hard. You taught me not to love. I have learned your lessons well." I could not watch the scene any longer, so I left the two women. I went into the garden. Yet even there, Miss Havisham's pleading reached my ears. As the time passed after my 21st birthday, I was unable to keep the resolve that I had made then to stay out of debt. In addition to the money that I owed to Cleriker to complete the contract I had made on Herbert's behalf, I owed my tailor, I owed my wine merchant, I owed my cheesemonger, I owed the jeweler, and many others. But I hoped that with every birthday, larger properties would be transferred to me from my benefactor, whereby I would be able to pay all of my debts at once. Then I would live in a really grand manner. I was 23 now, and I laughed. I laughed at myself, at the Pip of 21, who had thought that £500 a year was a great fortune. I never thought of the Pip who was once convinced that being a blacksmith in Kent was the most desirable position in the world. I was no longer tutored, but instead I read regularly for many hours a day. On one particular night I was at home reading because Herbert was away on a business trip and the weather was too stormy for me to go out. The clock at St. Paul's Cathedral struck 11, disturbing my concentration. The footsteps that I heard on the stairs disturbed it even more. Because the wind had blown out the lamps on the staircase, I took my reading lamp to the door. When my light flashed in the entryway, the footsteps stopped. I looked down the staircase and I called out, "Who's there? What do you want?" "I'm a-looking for Mr. Pip," answered the man coming up. When he saw me, the stranger's face lit. His clothes were rough but good enough. He had a long iron grey hair. I guessed he was about 60 years old, or that he had a large, muscular body. As he came level with me, he held out his sunburned hands. "I'm Pip. What is it? What business do you have with me?" "Ah, yes, my business. I'll explain it to you." When he paused, I understood that he expected to be asked in. Hesitantly, I did so. He looked about the parlor with a gratified smile. He turned and held out his hands to me again. I suspected that he might be mad, so I backed away.
Well, this is a disappointing reception after I've come so far and looked forward to so much to this meeting. Business. Mankind was my business.
No, wait, you're right. That is the wrong story. Without invitation, he threw off his coat and hat, and he sat in a chair by the fire. Stretching out his hands to the flames and looking over his shoulder at me, he says,
So, is there anyone else here?
What right do you have to ask me that? You, a stranger, coming into my rooms at this time of night and asking about... He shook his head and grinned with affection.
Well, you're a brave one, aren't you?
I'm glad you growed up to be a brave one. Like a bolt of lightning, it came to me that here was my convict from the churchyard and the marshes of Kent when I was a boy. He saw the recognition in my face and came to me, again with his hands outstretched. Hardly realizing what I was doing, I put out my hands. He grasped them heartily and kissed them.
Oh, you acted nobly, my boy. And you brought me that file to get out of my irons. You brought me food and drink, too. Oh, I never forgot that noble Pip. The only one that's ever done a kind thing for me.
As he was about to embrace me, I held a hand against his chest and pushed him away. But if you've come to thank me, it's not necessary. If I helped you as a child, I hope your gratitude has led you to a reformed way of life. In any case, I cannot offer you any protection now. He backed away from me and he looked around. When his eyes rested on the row of bottles on the sideboard, I said, Perhaps you'll have a warming drink before you leave, then.
Aye, whiskey.
He sat down. After I served both of us, I said, How have you been living these past years?
Oh, I've done wonderful well in New South Wales. I'm a sheep farmer. And may I be so bold as to ask how you have done since we were shivering on them marshes together so many years ago, boy?
Reluctantly, I told him my story. When I finished, he said quietly,
May I guess at your income since you came of age, I would say £500 a year.
He looked at me steadily. Though he spoke softly, his words entered my being like a scream, and I trembled.
And I suppose someone has been taking care of all this, A go-between, if you will, Would the first initial of that person's name be a J?
I could not speak. I felt as if I was suffocating, and I gripped a table for support.
In fact, boy, isn't that person's name Jaggers, and his clerk's name Wemmick?
My head was now reeling so that I had to feel my way to the sofa, where I fell back into the cushions. He helped me to sit up and dropped on one knee before me.
Yes, Pip, dear boy. I have made a gentleman of you. It's me what's done it. I swore that every cent I earned should go to you. When I began to earn pounds, I lived rough, so you should live smooth.
I shrank from him as if he were some terrible beast. I dreaded him.
You're more to me than a real son could ever be, Pip. Many a lonely night after herding the sheep, I'd be eating my solitary meal and your face would come to me. I'd say to myself, Aye, here's the boy again, looking at me while I eats my cheese and drinks my milk like he done on the marshes, hey? I'd swear again I'd make a gentleman of you that put life back in me once. And I'd done it. I'd done it, hadn't I?
He looked around with pleasure at the oriental rug, the paintings, my elegant clothes, the ruby ring I wore, and the books that I owned.
I'm famous for having put myself up in New South Wales, boy. They point me out behind my back for the convict I've been. But only I know that I owned a gentleman, which is more than any of them ever did. What kept me going was I knew someday I'd come back to see my boy and make myself known to him.
In his triumph and excitement, he did not notice how his touch repelled me, and with what misery I received his revelations. Finally, his effusive speech calmed, and he asked,
"So, where will I sleep, dear boy? I have a long and dangerous journey."
My roommate is away. You can have his bed. What do you mean? How do you mean dangerous?"
"Oh, Pip, lad. The authorities will hang me if they find me back in London."
I closed the curtains against any observers from the street, and I led him to Herbert's room, sick at heart that he had risked his life to see me. I wondered why I could not feel any tenderness for him and his fondness for me. Before I left him for the night, I asked, Was it only you?" He looked at me in surprise.
Yes, dear boy. Only me."
And there, Lord, there went my dream of Estella. So Miss Havisham had not singled me out to be Estella's husband. I was just her useful escort, a gigolo, someone to play with cruelly as the old woman had trained her to do. I sat looking at the dying fire until far into the morning, feeling more wretched than I had ever been. My convict's name was Abel Magwitch. Magwitch had met Mr. Jaggers when the lawyer had defended him. Jaggers had kept him from being hanged, but only on the condition that he leave England and settle in New South Wales and Australia. Magwitch's arrival brought new problems. I decided to face one problem at a time. I told my snooping landlady that my uncle had arrived. With Herbert soon to return from his business travels, I would have to find other rooms for Magwitch. The next morning he ate a huge breakfast, and with enjoyment, and afterward lit his pipe with a black vial smelling tobacco.
"Pip, Pip, lad, you must have horses of your own and a carriage, a servant to drive you."
He tossed a purse overflowing with money on the table and continued,
"Now here's something worth spending, dear boy. There's more where that came from, too. I've come to see that my gentleman spends his money like a gentleman."
I stopped him with a raised hand. We must discuss how to keep you safe while you are here, Magwitch. How long will you be staying, then?" He looked at me with surprise.
"I've come for good, lad. Ha! I've come for good, yes. Dyed hair and spectacles and elegant clothes will disguise me and keep me safe."
Fortunately, I was able to persuade him that a prosperous farmer's outfit would suit his sunburned face and work-worn hands much better. Before buying the clothes, I went to Mr. Jaggers' office. He and Mr. Wemmick exchanged a look as I entered. "No names!" Mr. Jaggers cried, apparently knowing the reason for my visit. "I have a visitor from New South Wales. He says he is my benefactor. Is that the truth, Jaggers?" "Aye, it is the truth," Mr. Jaggers said. Desperately, I said, I always supposed it was Miss Havisham, and you let me think so." No, Jaggers objected. "I did not. Miss Havisham may have encouraged this fanciful idea of yours, but it was just an amusement in her troubled mind." I was now convinced that Magwitch was my benefactor. I hurried home to rent rooms for him near my own. I brought back the farmer's clothes, but they did little to make him look like an ordinary citizen. That night, Magwitch fell asleep in an armchair in his new outfit. I wanted more than anything in the world to run away, out of the room, out of London, out of the country. But I stayed, longing for the moment when Herbert returned to advise me. Magwitch would not permit me to tell Herbert about him until he had seen my friend and made a judgment about Herbert's trustworthiness. Yet Herbert had not been home for more than 5 minutes before Magwitch nodded to me and took out a worn Bible on which to swear Herbert to secrecy. After I had taken Magwitch to his new rooms, Herbert and I talked late into the night. "I will not take another cent from Magwitch, even though I am deeply in debt and not trained for any profession. The money belongs to a criminal," I exclaimed. "Look, Pip, my friend, I understand how you feel, but you will destroy the man if you refuse his money. That is what he's lived for, Pip. I believe he would do himself damage if you did not buy a carriage and horses." "I will not get in deeper with him. I will not spend his money. I just want him to leave." If you do not want to be responsible for his capture and hanging, you must persuade him to leave England. But he won't, I replied. Then, Pip, you must go with him. I looked at Herbert, shocked. He continued, when you've got him safely away, break with him and come back and work with me at Clarker's. I agreed that Herbert's plan was, well, the only solution. While I was in the midst of making these arrangements, Estella summoned me to her home.
I'm going to be married soon. I warned you, you know.
When she told me that the groom was to be Bentley Drummle, whom I thought of as a repulsive spider, I protested vigorously. Estella shrugged her shoulders and said,
It is a suitable match. He is wealthy, and I have decided on it.
After leaving Estella, I walked the streets of London in a state of despair. I was no longer in a financial position to ask her to be my wife, and it was especially bitter that she had accepted the sulky Drummle she had teased.
Oh, Pip, don't imagine that I shall make him happy.
But her comment was no comfort to me. Returning very late to my rooms, I opened the door only to see a figure sitting in a chair by the fire jerk out of a deep sleep. We were both startled, but in a moment I saw it was Mr. Wemmick. He put his finger to his lips to indicate silence and motioned for me to draw closer.
Forgive me for startling you, Mr. Pip. Mr. Herbert gave me the key. Now beyond that we will not use any names. You understand me?
I nodded, my heart beginning to beat quickly. Is something wrong?
Yes and no,
replied Wemmick cryptically. I threw down my coat and hat and I sat close to Wemmick. He explained,
You may have noticed that Mr. Jaggers has clients of many kinds. Not all of them are the best class of people. Those type of people often hears things that you or I would not, since we don't spend time in low saloons or have friends among the criminal class, you know.
I was about to protest, but kept still.
One such low person passes on all gossip he hears to us because he wishes to keep on good terms with Mr. Jaggers in case he must ask for professional services, you see. Today we heard that a man named Compeyson is spreading the rumour that a visitor from New South Wales is in London. The rumour is bound to reach the authorities soon.
My face grew pale and I felt cold despite the heat from the fire.
Well, he must not be captured, I exclaimed. Mr. Jaggers and I agree most heartily, said Mr. Wemmick. Tonight, while you were out, Mr. Herbert and I arranged to shift the visitor from his rooms close to a house by the river. Mr. Jaggers imagined someone might follow you in the hopes of being led to the man, so the move was made without you being near.
Mr. Wemmick smiled his satisfaction, but cautioned.
More remains to be done. And Mick and I need your help.
I know, I said rather wildly. He must be taken out of London. I shall go with him, since he will not leave otherwise.
Oh, good, pronounced Wemmick. Remember, nothing should be done hastily. Mick, Mr. Jaggers, is most insistent on that point. He will contact you with the best time to proceed. Now, do not mention the name of Compeyson to your visitor. If he discovers that Compeyson is in London, he will want to find the man.
Wemmick moved his hand across his throat in a cutting motion. After Wemmick left, I stared into the fire as if I could divine in the flames the method by which Magwitch could be smuggled out of the country. Herbert's entrance interrupted my thoughts. He had just come from visiting his beloved Clara, who lived with her invalid father beside the river. From his window, the old man enjoyed watching the passing ships. As Herbert spoke, I had an inspiration. From Clara's house, we could row Magwitch out on the river and transfer us to a ship bound for anywhere. Their captors would do anything for money and ask no questions. You must buy a boat, then, Herbert said, obviously excited by the notion. We'll row on the river every day until people there get used to seeing us. Then on the day of the escape, there'll be no comment on our rowing out as usual. So the next day I bought a boat, and Herbert and I started rowing. At first we did not stay out long because we had to accustom our muscles to pulling an oar. I sent Magwitch's purse of money back to him by way of Herbert. Later, by a roundabout route, I managed to visit him myself, feeling certain that no one had followed me. When I met Clara Barley, I saw that she was a sweet girl with a round, pretty face. I congratulated Herbert on his choice, and he blushed with happiness at my praise of her. Magwitch was upset by the need to switch his lodging. He protested feebly, but I persuaded him that now was not the time to draw attention by investing in a showy carriage and horses. My plan to smuggle him out of London caused a greater stir until he understood that I was going with him. He clasped my hand in both of his, and he held it until I had to leave. Of course, I gave no hint that I would separate from him once we got him safely away. My financial situation was now so bad I had to sell some jewelry. I decided to turn to Miss Havisham to pay off the contract with clericers on Herbert's behalf. On my way to the coach station, I stopped at Mr. Jagger's office to tell him of my plans. Jaggers nodded his approval for Magwitch, but said, "Don't be in too much of a hurry, Pip. The best place to hide is in a big city like London." Near the end of our conversation, Jagger's servant, Molly, entered with his hot lunch. Head down, she put the tray on a small table. As I rose to leave, I jostled the tray and the soup splashed over its bowl a little. Molly's head came up angrily and her eyes flashed at me for a second. Now I tell you, the momentary flare of Molly's temper made me gasp. For I saw there in Molly's eyes Estella's angry, contemptuous eyes. And in Molly's nose and her cheeks, I saw features that were identical to Estella's. When my conversation with Mr. Jaggers had ended, I took Mr. Wemmick aside in the outer office and I asked about the servant.
"Molly? Aye, she's a murderess, Pip. Jaggers was her lawyer and he got her off. It was jealousy of her husband that caused the crime. She was accused of killing their child as well."
As the coach jolted me toward Miss Havisham's house, I went over again and again the story that Wemmick had confided in me. Molly had some gypsy blood in her, and when she imagined that her husband was being lured away by another woman, she had strangled her rival. And then, as revenge on her husband, Wemmick said she was supposed to have also killed their child. Well, I knew this was not so, for Estella had to be that child. I could not be mistaken in recognizing the origins of those eyes. Oh, God help me, those eyes that I had loved for so long.
Molly had to be Estella's mother, and had probably been glad to let Mr. Jagger save her child from a life of poverty.
When I arrived at Miss Havisham, she seemed to me to be older and weaker. She listened quietly to me to describe the help I had given to Herbert and present inability to complete the contract. "The sum I need, Miss Havisham, is £900, I told her. Miss Havisham was not shocked. Instead, she looked into the fire and said in a dreamy, faraway voice,
"Aye, Herbert's father, Matthew Pocket, once gave me some advice. Aye, he gave me some advice that I did not take, and I have been very unhappy ever since."
She roused herself and added sharply,
"If I give you the money, Pip, will you promise to keep it a secret from the Pockets?"
I gave her my promise, and she wrote a short note to Mr. Jaggers instructing him to pay out the money from her account. I took the note and thanked her. Then as I turned to go, she called to me in a trembling voice.
Pip, Pip, you see how alone I am now? How even she has deserted even me."
I answered quietly, "It could never have ended in any other way, Miss Havisham." Although I had avoided reading the newspapers because I did not want to know when the wedding was to occur, I asked, "So, is she married then?" Miss Havisham nodded her affirmation. She gasped, and her cane fell from her hand.
"Ah, I see the pain in your face, Pip. You feel as I felt when I was deserted by the person I loved."
Of course, she was right, and I could not control my emotions. I covered my face with my hands until I could regain my composure. Miss Havisham wept openly also. When I looked at her again, she was rocking from side to side.
"Oh, my God, what have I done?" Oh, what have I done, Pip? What have I done?
I wanted to answer that she had ruined my life, but that would only be partly true. I had made many mistakes, and I had entertained many foolish hopes and dreams, many false, great expectations.
Forgive me, Pip. Forgive me,
she pleaded, holding out her hands. I went to her, and I took the aged, trembling hands in mine. I do forgive you, Miss Havisham. She pressed my hands and would not let go.
In the beginning, I did not mean to be wicked. I just wanted to keep Estella from suffering as I had suffered. But she began to grow into a beauty, Pip, and I raised her, I praised her, I spoiled her, I warned her against love.
I detached my hands from hers and drew up a stool beside her. Whose child is Estella? I asked. She shook her head.
I don't know. At some point in my wasted, wretched life, I decided that I wanted to adopt a child to love and to keep safe from my fate. I told Mr. Jaggers, Mick, our mutual friend, Mr. Jaggers, and he said he would look about for an orphan. One night he arrived with a little girl.
We talked no more. I stayed with Miss Havisham as she fell into a light doze near the fireplace. And then I went down the stairs and I wandered about the house for a bit, for I felt it was the last time I should see it. Suddenly, a terrible scream reached my ears. I raced upstairs and I found Miss Havisham's room on fire. She came toddling toward me, flames blazing from her wedding dress and veil. I tore off my coat, I wrapped her in it to smother the flames. She struggled against me, but I held her down, trying at the same time to beat out the flames, licking at her hair. Tell her I forgive her! Tell her I forgive her! She screeched above the noise of the fire and flames. Servants burst in and fought the fire. The doctor was sent for, and Miss Havisham was found to be alive, but unconscious. After treating my badly burned hands, the doctor said there was nothing more for me to do there. The next day, I returned to London. I was still in a state of shock when I reached home. Herbert changed the bandages and made me lie down. I could move the fingers of my right hand, but my left hand had to be kept perfectly still. The doctor made a sling for it. I still had many errands to do, but I felt feverish, so Herbert insisted on attending to some of the errands for me. He notified his father and Miss Havisham's other relatives of the fire and her condition. He also contacted Estella, who was in Paris at an address furnished by Mr. Jaggers. There remained matters to which only I could attend. When I felt a little stronger, I went to Mr. Jaggers. I gave him Miss Havisham's note. He made out a cheque for £900 to Cleriker, and he sent a messenger asking him to meet me at Jaggers' office. Cleriker arrived and accepted the final payment called for by our contract. He explained that the shipping business was expanding every day and that Herbert would soon be made a full partner. First, Herbert will be sent to the East to open and manage one of our branch offices, he revealed. After Cleriker left us, Jaggers called me aside. Now, Pip, no names now. But it's time for a visitor from New South Wales to leave London. The authorities are circling in too closely. When I returned home and I told Herbert what Jaggers had advised, we looked at my bandaged hands in despair. I could not row a boat. So Herbert devised a solution. We shall enlist the aid of Startop, he announced. Now, Startop had been tutored by Herbert's father, along with me and the hateful Drummel. He was honest and dependable and agreed to help us. Watchful of being followed, we went to Clara Barley's house by the river to alert Magwitch. He was shocked to see me bandaged and was more concerned with any pain I might have suffered than with the escape plan. Oh, dear boy, I don't deserve your goodness. Oh, you're dearer to me than the son I never had, and dearer even than the daughter I did once have. Why, you never spoke of a child. Where is she now, your daughter? Oh. Magwitch began with a deep sigh. Oh, it's a terrible story, Pip, but you two deserve to know everything about me. I'll just light my pipe and have a sip of whiskey while I begin my sorry tale. He filled it with the noxious tobacco he favoured. I had offered to get him some of the best that London imported, but he refused.
Now, I don't know who my own parents were, all right. I only know that I was in and out of jail all my life. I married a young gypsy woman, or part gypsy she was. We had a little girl. My wife was hot-tempered, you see. She choked to death another woman because she was jealous, and she threatened to kill our little girl. Before I knew it, my wife had taken our child and left us. The next thing I knew, she was arrested, and she ordered to stand trial for murdering that woman, which she certainly had done. Mr. Jaggers took on her defence. That was how I got to know his name. I disappeared then, because otherwise I would have had to testify that my wife had killed our little girl. It was not until much later that I heard that Mr. Jaggers had got my wife off. A wonderful clever man is Mr. Jaggers, you know.
I was fortunate that the shock of the fire had left me pale and worn. Otherwise Herbert and Magwitch would surely have noticed the powerful effect the story had on me. I was unable to speak a word. Magwitch's pipe had gone out. He relit it and went on.
Oh, after all these years, I don't hate my wife for what she's done anymore. There's only one person I hate, and that's the one I was fighting on the marshes back in the time when I first seen my boy here.
Magwitch reached over and patted my knee. Although my head ached with confusion and distress, I managed to nod encouragingly at him.
That wicked man used me. He appeared to be something of a gentleman, so I trusted him. He'd planned a crime and I'd carry it out. That way he was safe and dry, you see, while I was the one in danger. He also took most of the money we made, since he said it was his brains that figured out how to get it, that my strong back and daring could easily be replaced. Eventually I was caught in the act. Right off, he demanded separate trials. He gave evidence against me, saying that I had forced him into breaking the law. The court saw a nice-spoken, well-judged gentleman talking against me. Aye, who are they going to believe? So I went to prison. He went free. And I swore to get my revenge. When I got out of prison, his wife told me he was down in Kent, tricking some rich woman out of her money. I chased him then and many times after. I found him on the marshes, Pip. I could have gone free, but I wouldn't have Compasson go free too. I wanted him in jail.
Herbert looked startled when Magwitch mentioned Compasson's name, but he said nothing. When we left Magwitch, Herbert and I started to speak at the same time. My voice was louder, so I got to tell my story first. I told Herbert about Molly and the information Wemmick had given me about her and joined her story to Magwitch's tale. So Magwitch is Estella's father, I concluded, but it would do no one any good to have it known. Herbert agreed, and we swore to keep it a secret. And this man Compasson? Herbert began to say. I interrupted him. Compasson is in London, but Magwitch must not know. That is why I did not mention his name to you after Mr. Wemmick told me about him. What I was about to say, said Herbert, is that Compasson was Miss Havisham's beloved that left her at the altar, eh? With this news, Herbert had rendered me speechless. Wednesday was set for Magwitch's escape. On Monday and Tuesday, Herbert and I made inquiries about the foreign steamers that would be leaving when our rowboat could meet up with them. We settled on one bound for Hamburg, Germany, and we found out what she looked like. The plan was to row down the Thames River to Clara's house. When Magwitch saw us coming, he would come down the stone steps to the river. It was necessary to go downriver on an earlier tide and lie in wait for our steamer to approach. Startop and Herbert would row and I would steer. Startop was told only that this was a harmless little outing for our indulgences. So while I secured passports with the help of Mr. Jaggers, Herbert alerted Startop and Magwitch. Well, nervous as we were, Herbert and I had a feeling of being watched, but we could detect no one following us. Wednesday was one of those March days, you know, when it feels like summer in the sun and winter in the shade. Herbert and I wore heavy jackets, and I took a bag with toilet articles and a few changes of clothes. Where I was going or what I might do, there were questions I did not think about. Magwitch's safety was my only concern now. As I went out the door of our rooms, I turned for a last look. Most likely it would be the last look, and I would not see them ever again. Startop was waiting by my boat when I arrived. We cast off at 8:30 that morning. Soon we were part of the river traffic of coal barges and steamers and oyster boats and rowboats just like ours, with their occupants out for pleasure or exercise. We intended to row with the tide until it turned in the afternoon. Then we would continue on rowing against the tide until dark. That would take us somewhere between Kent and Essex, where the river is broad and solitary. We'd spend the night in an isolated inn, and the Hamburg steamer would start from London with the tide about 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. As we rode toward the stone steps by Clara's house, we saw Magwitch coming down to meet us. He wore a cloak and carried a black canvas bag, the outfit which made him look like a river pilot. We pulled over quickly, and Herbert gave him a hand on board. Magwitch put an arm around my shoulder and said,
"Aye, faithful boy, that was well done, aye."
I pressed his hand, and I looked nervously about to see if anyone had observed him aboard our craft. While we anxiously proceeded downriver, Magwitch calmly smoked his pipe as if he did not share our fears. At nightfall we came opposite to a run-down inn. The innkeeper and his wife looked like villains, yet they served a good and generous meal which we ate by the fire. Herbert and Startup, who now knew of the escape plan, were tired from rowing and slept soundly. I shared a room with Magwitch, for I didn't like to have him out of my sight. He may sound like a pirate, but he wasn't a very good pirate. I slept with most of my clothes on, and I woke several times during the night, thinking that I heard men's voices. I looked out the window, and I saw, lit by moonlight, the pier where we had tied our boat. 2 men were looking in the boat. Before I could make a move, they continued on to the marsh without a glance toward the inn. I guessed that they were customs inspectors. The next morning we rose early. We returned to our boat. We stayed in a sheltered part of the bank until just after midday, and we saw the smoke of the Hamburg steamer. Magwitch and I prepared ourselves in our bags. I shook hands with Startup and Herbert. Neither Herbert's eyes nor my own were quite dry. We rowed out into the path of the steamer bearing down on us, while another boat launched. Another rowboat. Another rowboat from another spot on the bank did the same. The rowers drew alongside us, leaving just enough room for the play of the oars. Apart from the rowers, one man sat wrapped in a cloak and whispered instructions to another who steered the boat. The man in the cloak hailed us. "You've returned a convict with you. I order Abel Magwitch to surrender. I order you to persist in apprehending him." At the same moment, his rowers pulled ahead and in front of us, blocking our way. Hands reached out and held our boat fast to theirs. This caused great confusion aboard the steamer. Some voices called to us, and others commanded their paddles to stop. Still, the steamer bore down on us. The steersman in the rowboat leaned into our boat and laid his hand on Magwitch's shoulder. In turn, Magwitch leaned across and pulled the cloak from the man who was giving the orders. He was none other than Compeyson. Terror-stricken, Compeyson lurched backwards as Magwitch tumbled onto him, tossing them both into the water. In the process, Magwitch capsized our boat. I was in the water a few moments only when I was pulled into the other rowboat. Herbert was pulled in next, followed by Startup. I looked about frantically for Magwitch, who was feebly trying to keep himself afloat. The rowers spotted him and hauled him on board, chaining him at the wrists and ankles. Our escape had failed. Magwitch was breathing with difficulty. He'd received a chest wound and a deep cut on his head when the Hamburg steamer had swept over him. I cradled him in my arms, bandaged hands trying to convey my presence to him, while in whispered gasps he explained that he and Compeyson had gone into the water, locked in each other's arms. There was a struggle, and Magwitch had broken free. The boat circled the area where Compeyson was last seen, but he was nowhere to be found. Later, his body was recovered along the bank. They rowed back to the inn, where I purchased dry clothes for Magwitch, but the officer in charge said that all of the prisoner's possessions, including his wet clothes and his money, must be turned over to the authorities in London. Knowing this would break Magwitch's heart, I decided not to tell him. I sat beside Magwitch. I held his hand. I urged him to conserve his strength. He struggled to speak and could not be dissuaded from unburdening himself.
"Dear boy, I knew I was taking a chance coming back to England, but I had to see you. Don't you see? I had to see you. It's best that a gentleman like you have become, seem to have no connection with the likes of me. Just maybe sit in the courtroom where I can see you. Now don't ask for more, all right?" "No, I will never stir from your side as long as they permit me to be with you. I will be as true to you as you have been to me.
His hand trembled in mine, but I could see that he was pleased by my recognition of his sacrifices. When he fell asleep, he was still smiling. Magwitch's trial was brief and clear. Mr. Jaggers acted in his defense, but he warned me that the matter was hopeless. Even though he introduced testimony that Magwitch had reformed and become a respected and a wealthy man in New South Wales, the fact remained that he was a returned convict who had been warned not to return under punishment of death. Magwitch grew weaker every day. He faced his jury with ebbing strength, yet they took no pity on the wounded man. For his part, Magwitch was respectful, even noble, and accepting of what fate held for him. When the judge sentenced him to death, Magwitch said to him, "My lord, I have received a sentence of death from the Almighty, but I bow to your sentence." I honestly hoped and prayed that he might die before the judge's sentence could be carried out. Dreading that he might linger, I wrote appeal after appeal, setting forth his case in mind. Everyone in authority might help, and I followed my petitions with personal visits. I was able to pay daily visits to Magwitch in the prison hospital. He was sinking slowly and hardly spoke at all now. He responded with a slight pressure on my hand as I held his weak one. On my 10th visit, I saw that a change had come over Magwitch. His eyes were turned toward the door expectantly and lit up as I entered.
Dear boy, you're always the first visitor into the ward.
Well, I wait by the gate so that when they open I won't miss a minute of my allotted time with you.
Thank you, dear boy. You have never deserted me.
I pressed his hands in silence, for I could not forget that I had once meant to desert him.
You seem closer to me since I came under this dark cloud than when the sun shone. It's worth everything to me, boy.
I noticed that he breathed with greater difficulty, and his face was drained of the little color it held. Are you in much pain?
I won't complain, dear boy.
Those were his last words. He made a weak gesture with his hand. I understood that he wanted me to lay my hand on his breast. I did so, and he smiled and covered my hand with both of his. The bell sounding the end of my visiting hours rang just as the prison doctor entered. He leaned over Magwitch, and he shook his head with finality. Then he put a hand on my shoulder, indicating that I should remain in my seat. I did as he requested, but I leaned over my benefactor for a parting revelation. Dear Magwitch. Fighting back the tears, I whispered, I must tell you something at this last moment. Can you understand me still? He pressed my hand weakly and indicated that he did. Magwitch, you had a child once, whom you lost. I felt a stronger pressure on my hand. Magwitch, she wasn't killed, as you feared. She lived, and she found powerful friends. She's living now. She's a lady, Magwitch, a very beautiful lady, and I'm in love with her. Magwitch raised my hand to his lips and kissed it. Then he let it sink back on his breast. A placid look came over his face. His head dropped quietly to one side, and Magwitch was dead. I was not horrified by witnessing death so closely. I felt as peaceful as the silent, aged face on the pillow, for while I had not been true to Joe Gargery and his friendship, I had found the strength of heart to be true to Magwitch and remain his dear boy to the end. Yes. See, Magwitch was married to the gypsy girl who killed the guy, the girl that tried to get in. Then his daughter got away, and his daughter was raised by Miss Havisham, who was actually Estella. You see, but we're not done yet. No. When would I not have run over the hour? When I was finally able to turn my attention back to my own affairs, I found that I was heavily in debt. I had to sublet my expensive rooms until the end of my lease. Herbert had already gone to East to manage Clarker's new branch office in Cairo, Egypt. Before leaving, he had assured me that some position would always exist for me at that branch. Now, I could make no decisions about my life, for I was becoming ill. For weeks I had felt that some serious illness was trying to claim me. But I fought it off until Magwitch had died. But now a fever came on me. I lay in bed shivering. My body ached. From time to time I would summon great strength and wander in the streets in a delirium. I came to my senses one day, still hot with fever, to find 2 men looking down at me as I lay in the street outside my own house.
"Who are you? What do you want?"
I called out hoarsely.
"Well, sir, we've come to arrest you for debt."
I groaned and attempted to get up, but my legs buckled under me.
I would come with you if I could, but you see how ill I am."
They went across the street and argued with one another, but ended up by leaving. I stumbled into the house. I relapsed into fever and nightmares. All of the people I had known in my life seemed to be sitting, one after another, at my bedside. I mumbled and I shouted and became sick. One by one, the ghostly visitors disappeared, leaving only Joe as my companion. The hand that sponged my hot face with cool water always seemed to be Joe's. The face that looked at me with tender expression always seemed to be Joe's. Finally, I asked weakly, Is it Joe?" Joe's welcome voice answered,
"Aye, that it is, dear old Pip. It's me." "Joe, you should be angry with me. Strike me, Joe. Tell me how I betrayed our friendship. Don't be so good to me."
But Joe was so happy I recognized him that he knelt beside my bed and gave me a hug.
"You and me was always friends, dear old Pip. Now be calm and get well,"
he said, his eyes filling with tears.
"Joe had been nursing me for a month. How long was I sick before that? I don't remember. Slowly I regained my strength, and it was like the old days in the house on the marshes. I fancied I was little Pip again, for Joe talked to me with his native simplicity and cared for me in his touching, protective way. One afternoon, when Joe judged me strong enough, he told me that Miss Havisham had died from injuries sustained in the fire. I squeaked out loud, I think. As expected, she left her money to Estella. Now that the subject had arisen, I offered to tell him about my own great expectations and my mysterious benefactor. Joe broke in to say that he had heard something about my experiences, but that it wasn't necessary for friends to talk of such things. Then, as if to proclaim an end of the matter, he jumped up to prepare our evening meal. When Joe was certain that I was nearly recovered, he left. He stole away early one morning, leaving a smudged and badly spelled note of farewell. As he had proudly told me, Biddy had taught him to read and write. Enclosed in the note was a paid receipt for the debt for which I had been arrested. It was in Joe's name. Up to this moment I had not let myself think about the creditor, hoping that he had withdrawn court proceedings until I was better. I never dreamed that Joe had paid off my debts. I sat with Joe's note and the receipt in my hand, thinking about my foolish, selfish life of recent years. I remember the clean, clear air that blew up from the river and over the marshes where I had been raised. I remember the sweet face of sensible Biddy appearing to me. She had been my friend, my confidant, since she arrived after my sister's attack. What better way is there to change my life than to go home and marry Biddy, I asked myself. I will show her how humble and repentant I am. I will ask her to be my wife. If she wants me to work at the forge with Joe, I'll do it. If she wishes me to find some occupation in the village or in the country, then I'll do that. I will tell her of Herbert's offer, and if she wishes us to go to Egypt, but God will marry her, and that's what we'll do. So 3 days later, I took the coach to Kent. The June weather was mild and enlivening. The sky was blue. The larks were soaring high over the green corn. At the forge, I did not hear the clink of Joe's hammer. It was closed. The house was not deserted, for I saw fresh white curtains fluttering on the open window of the parlor. I hurried to the window and I looked in. Joe and Biddy were standing arm in arm. When they saw me, they shouted with joy and ran to embrace me. Pip, Joe and I have just been married. Oh, now that you're home, dearest Pip, my wedding day is quite perfect. I managed to congratulate them without showing my own disappointment. I spent several hours with them before hurrying back to London. There I sold all I had and I arranged to pay my creditors little by little. Then I traveled to Egypt and took a position as a clerk in Cleriker and Company. Herbert had married Clara. I lived with them. Gradually I rose in the firm. I paid all of my debts. I lived well within my means. After several years, I became a partner in Cleric's. Meanwhile, I wrote constantly to Joe and Biddy. Our firm was never one of the largest, but we made a profit and we had a good reputation. One day, Cleriker could not bear to keep the secret of Herbert's partnership any longer, so he told Herbert how it had come about. By now, though, Herbert's ability would have brought him a partnership on his own. Nevertheless, he was grateful that I had helped him when he needed it most.
11 years later, on an evening in December, I returned to England. I quietly pushed open the kitchen door of the house on the marshes, and I saw smoking his pipe by the fire dear Joe. His hair showed only a little grey, and sitting opposite to him on my own little old stool was a little Pip. Joe jumped up to welcome me back and kept touching me to make sure that I had truly arrived while the little boy hung back. Biddy rushed in and kissed me. After a few days, young Pip grew used to me, his namesake, and we became friends. We went for walks on the marshes. I showed him my family's tombstones. To understand his thoughts and feelings, I had only to remember my own at his age in this place. By the time I left, Pip was as attached to me as I had been to Joe when I was young. He stood by the forge and waited until I was out of sight. Before I left for London, I went to visit the site of Miss Havisham's house. Nothing of the burned-out house remained, only the garden was there, pushing wildly into the space once occupied by the house. I went through the old gate, which was no longer locked. I sat on a stone bench. Thoughts of Estella came rushing to me. I had heard that her life with Bentley Drummle had been most unhappy. In fact, Estella had left him. I heard that he had been killed in a riding accident soon after, but that had been 2 years ago. Perhaps Estella had since remarried. I wandered farther back in the garden, which looked stripped and desolate in the winter air. A woman stood there forlornly in the moonlight. Hearing my footsteps, she turned. We recognized one another at the same time. "Estella!" I cried and rushed to her. I am greatly changed, Pip. It's a wonder that you recognize me." Her youthful freshness was, indeed, gone, but she had kept the majesty and the charm of her beauty. Her proud eyes were changed also now, and held a soft saddened look. We sat on a bench, and asked if she came here often. "No, I came here tonight for the first time, to say goodbye to the place. The property was my last remaining possession. I have sold it. Do you still live abroad, Pip?" When I told her of my partnership with Cleric and Company, she seemed pleased. "I have thought of you often," Estella admitted. "For a time I could not bear to think of you and the love that I had thrown away in my ignorance. But now I have given it a place in my heart." She smiled gently. "You've always held a place in my heart," I said, taking her hand in mine. We sat in silence for a time. Eventually Estella broke it and said, "My suffering all these years has come to be a stronger teacher to me than all our other teachers. I have been bent and broken, Pip, but I hope into a better shape now. And since I must part from you again, I'm glad that our parting is taking place here, in a place that I must also part with. I hope, Pip, that you have forgiven me, and that we shall part as friends." "We are friends. And as for parting, that remains to be seen." We rose from the bench, her hand still in mine, and walked slowly away together, leaving the shadow of Miss Havisham behind, and the shadow of parting from Estella never crossed my mind again.